say what you want about Donald Trump as a person, say what you want about his morals. He does have an ability to communicate that is really unparalleled. And it's why, for now, more than 10 years, we've been talking about him and why he's going to end up being one of the most consequential presidents of our lifetimes. Simple thing.
God.
The thing about it is that as this podcast goes live on Inauguration Day, Donald Trump is at the peak of his influence and at the peak of
Mm,
his popularity. The reality is soon going to hit many Americans. You know, he promised an awful lot of things during this campaign,
yeah.
an awful lot of things, many more things than he promised in his previous campaigns. And he now presumably is going to be held accountable for making good on some of these promises.
Hello, and welcome to Eric McElroy's American Exchange with me, Eric McElroy. Funny how that works. Welcome once again to the podcast, or welcome to the first time to the podcast. This is where me, Eric, dial across the pond over to the United States to find out what is happening in my home country. This week, I'm very pleased to welcome back the host of Political Wire, Tegan Godard, to the podcast. He was back with us all the way back in 2021, so it's been really far too long. If you've not checked out the Political Wire, it's an incredible website that pulls together the most relevant, the most interesting political news of the day, particularly with a focus on the US, but often with world and global news included as well. Tegan is great at picking and identifying the trends and the interesting things that are happening because he is a political junkie like I am, but to another whole level. It's a website that's been around for over 30 years. It's an incredible resource if you're interested in politics. It's where I go to see what's happening. If you could break a refresh button on your browser, that would be me going to the Political Wire. So Tegan sees these trends because he's reading them and identifying them, and presenting them, probably more than anyone that I've ever talked to in the podcast or on any of the other sites that I go to. And what's great, and we talk about this in the pod, with the shifting media landscape, that he's still looking at the traditional media, but also looking at other media sources as well, and presenting a glimpse of what is happening and what are the trends. So we have a conversation where we look back at the Biden and Harris legacy, and then we look forward to our new yet old president, Donald J. Trump. Yep, I'm not one of those deniers. He won, but here we go. So it's a great conversation with Tegan. It's great to catch up and get his sense of what has happened, what's led us here, and where things are likely to be going in the future. So please enjoy Tegan Godard. Oh, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you know what I'm going to say, got to subscribe. Do the subscribe thing. And you can see previous episodes and you can see clips of me doing stand up comedy. So subscribe to the channel and please feel free to share this as well. Here we go with Tegan. Well, I'm very excited to welcome back to the podcast someone I haven't talked to in quite a while now. Much has happened. I look back, Tegan, since last time we talked, was before Trump had even declared to run for president. So whatever happened to Donald Trump? What happened to that guy?
Well, it is that's amazing because Trump announced, as you recall, he announced his reelection really early. It was the week
Yeah.
after the midterm elections, and people were kind of shocked at how early he announced and what
Hmm.
the reasoning for it was, whether it was to block his many legal cases, whether it was to crowd out the Republican primary field, a combination of both. But he did it early, and it seemed to have worked for him because as we
Yeah.
speak here, he's getting ready to take office for another term.
It's absolutely insane. So I guess because this is going out on the day of the inauguration of Donald Trump as the 47th president of the United States, it just when I say it. I guess well, if we look back on Biden and his legacy, how do you feel this? Is it going to be completely defined by the fact that he lost to Trump? Do you think there's going to be, because I think up until that point, there were some good things to be seen there.
Well, no, there's no doubt that Joe Biden had a historic legislative accomplishments. He passed more legislation related to his agenda than any president since Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah.
So that's the great paradox about this, because at the same time, his approval rates were never very high. He leaves office with his approval rates at the lowest level, depending upon what polls you're looking at. They're no higher than the mid 30s. So they're just terrible approval rates. It's also an indication because approval rates are somewhat indicative of whether the party in power can win re-election again. It's a reason why Democrats lost the election. Joe Biden
Mm,
was just not a popular president.
yeah.
And there's a lot of reasons for that, but we could talk about the economic reasons. We can talk about the others. One that I've been thinking about is the thing that we just don't know, but many suspected, which is, was Joe Biden truly up to the job?
Mm,
Meaning, was he too old?
yeah.
We saw Biden throughout his presidency. He had a very slow gait. He had halting speaking style. He was never a great speaker, but at times he seemed confused even. And, it made you wonder. But at the same time,
Mm,
we never really saw reports of, lawmakers who were meeting privately with Biden, foreign leaders who were meeting with Biden. We never really saw reports that suggested he was out of it, that he truly had a diminished mental capacity. But at the same time, we had a White House who did seem to keep him away from the news media. He gave very few press conferences. He gave very few interviews, one-on-one interviews. And it was that debate in June of 2024 against Donald Trump where the wheels seemed to come off and everyone
yeah.
concluded Biden's not up to the job anymore. And so the thing about Biden's legacy that I'm most interested in, and that historians will hopefully be able to fill in the big picture here, is was he really up to the job? Was there a
Mm,
cover-up going on? We learned in later years that Ronald Reagan, who was already suffering from Alzheimer's disease during the presidency, and we learned that particularly in his last 2 years, that there were some moments where Ronald Reagan really wasn't fully there, which is a
mm,
scary thought for the most powerful person in the world. We don't
yeah.
have those reports about Biden at this point, but it's one thing I want to know because you've got this strange paradox, as I said. Biden, on the one hand, had enormous accomplishments
Yep.
and yet never seemed to get credit for them. And was that simply superficial because of his speaking style and he wasn't able to
Mm.
communicate very clearly? Or was there something deeper there that Americans just didn't trust his ability to lead? We don't know yet.
Yeah, there is so much there. I mean, because the messaging is so important now, and the way people receive, the way that the typical person receives information, and where Donald Trump and Republicans are so effective is that they just hammer away at the same points over and over and over again. Usually, in my view, those points are complete bullshit, or it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, they just hammer at the same things. And when you can't communicate well, as Biden couldn't, and then you can't be consistent with the message, does anything break through the noise?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, it is, the realities of the modern presidency are just different than those when Biden first stepped in the political scene in the early 1970s.
Yeah.
And, we saw communications technology change dramatically over that time. We saw, I guess it officially started with John F. Kennedy in television being the most important
Mm.
medium, but I certainly remember Ronald Reagan, claiming this great ability to get his message out
Yeah.
using television in a very effective way. Then we saw, the rise of the internet and everything that did to communications. And we think of Barack Obama as someone who successfully
Mm.
harnessed social media and other avenues like, using the internet to get out his message. That's continued to change, and I'm not sure Biden kept up with those changes or if Biden had the ability to utilize
Yeah.
these new channels. It's just something that we don't know. But the presidency obviously changed dramatically over Biden's 50 years of public service.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting that the first thing that you're wondering about is, when did he start to slip? Because I mean, communication wise, there's no question that he slipped. I mean, that's unsurprising for somebody in their late 70s or early 80s. I mean, but the people that I was interviewing for this podcast who were in the room, and you're there and talking to people all the time, I would ask them, you've interviewed Biden or you've been in the White House briefing room and been, in the few times he's been near it, is he there? And the answer generally was yes, he is. The Republicans were saying he was in cognitive decline from day one, and that wasn't true. But then the debate happened, and then you can see it in even his final address, and all of he's an older man. There's no question there.
Yeah, there's no there is no question. And again, as I said, I don't see many private reports of Biden acting like he wasn't fully there.
Yeah.
He met with plenty of Republican lawmakers. They didn't come out of the White House and say, "Wow, the president is diminished. The president's not capable." You saw foreign leaders who really have no reason to cover up his behavior. But at the
Mm.
same time, you can't help but think Biden was shielded,
Yeah.
particularly after his debate performance. And so, anyway, at the end of the day, Biden's legacy is going to be overshadowed by the fact that the man he was elected to replace returned again to power. And
Yeah.
so that is a failure of his presidency under any definition, because that's not what he was elected to do. He was elected to
Yeah.
move on from Trump. And unfortunately for Biden and for the Democrats, he did not. Um, so that's just going to always be the opening line of his legacy.
Yeah.
At the same time, you have to acknowledge the fact that he had many accomplishments, many more than most lawmakers, and many more than most presidents. And when you think about Donald Trump's legislative agenda, back in his first term, he really
Yeah.
essentially got one bill passed, which was his tax cuts.
Yeah.
There really wasn't anything that else happened legislatively for 4 years. Biden passed the, American Rescue Act, the Infrastructure Act. These are many trillions of dollars worth of government spending was passed in these acts in order to improve the lives of Americans. And,
Mm.
I heard from some readers just yesterday about how they had prescription medications that were,
Mm.
for this coming year that were, going to cost them many, many thousands of dollars, except for the fact that Biden has now capped those under Medicare.
Mm.
And that is a major, major benefit to people's lives, that will impact them for many years to come. When you think about some of these legislative initiatives, something like, the Affordable Care Act under Barack Obama, that's something the Republicans tried dozens and dozens and dozens of times to repeal, to replace, to do, to get rid of. They were unable to, and now it is a lasting legacy of Barack Obama,
Yeah.
probably the biggest legacy of his presidency.
Mm.
But what Barack Obama didn't have was this lingering question about whether he was capable of leading. And
Yeah.
that's a sad thing for Biden, particularly. And I suspect historians are going to begin to fill in the picture about what happened here. And
Mm.
just like they did with Ronald Reagan, it will be interesting to see what that picture is, because that's the one big unknown that I don't know. And as someone who pays an awful lot of attention to political news and reporting, it's just I don't have an answer to that right now, and that's something that I'm definitely interested in finding as people dig into the public record and the private record and begin to talk after Biden leaves the presidency.
Yeah. And I guess the final question looking back is, do you think that there was any way, considering how late the ball was passed to Kamala, that she could have carried it over the line?
It's one of those great questions that political junkies will debate forever. I'm on the record saying Kamala Harris, I think she did about as good a job as anyone could do in the 100 days that she had to
Yeah.
run a campaign. I definitely think there's something to the argument that had Democrats had a proper primary season and that
Mm.
they had months and months to introduce the possible candidates to America, and that they had debates, and that America could get to know them, and they could have some candidates succeed and some candidates fail. Maybe
Mm.
Kamala Harris would have come out as the Democratic nominee in the end.
Yeah.
But even if she had still been the Democratic nominee, I think that process would have been very helpful to her
Yeah.
at pitching her candidacy. The one thing that she was always hampered by, of course, was she could never really criticize the president because she
Right.
served as his vice president. And that was really an albatross for her the entire time because it's very clear that Americans, for most of the last 15 years, every 2 years seems to be a change election.
Mm,
we seem to throw out the leaders of Congress, we seem to throw out the president quite regularly here during this time period. It means there's a lot of dissatisfaction with how things are going in the country. The
mhm.
right track, wrong track polls are just off the charts about how most Americans, Democrats and Republicans, think the country's on the wrong track. What they're seeking, it's not entirely clear. Joe Biden offered a vision and he was elected. Now Donald Trump has offered a very different vision and he was elected. So I'm not sure Americans know what they're looking for, but um, I think it would have been hard for any Democrat in that environment to win.
Yeah,
A lot of economists say it was all about inflation, and that's true. And we've seen the inflation and other, in other causes of the pandemic. We've seen that play out across the world. So there really isn't an industrialized nation that hasn't turned
yeah.
on the incumbent party during this time. So, it suggests that almost nobody could have won.
I think that's one of the most diplomatic ways I've heard anyone say it is that Donald Trump has a different vision from America than Biden did. That's about as nice as you can possibly say that. Uh, yeah, I agree. I think that, well, just again, and I'm always watching this from afar, so I'm absorbing it pretty much through sources like yours and other pieces of media without a sense of the vibe that's happening in the States. But I think America's just too big of a country, and there's too much noise in people's normal lives to try and run a 3-month campaign. That's because that's what we have here in the UK. The legal campaign length is 6 weeks long. But
Right.
then, the UK is only 60 million people or 65 million people or whatever it is. So it's a very different media market, and a different, well, it's changing a little bit here, but in general, yeah, the tone of things is slightly different than it is in the States. So as we close the book on the Biden-Harris chapter, we're cracking open a new one today. Trump Unleashed is how I'm thinking maybe this presidency is going to be called. I mean, the guardrails are gone. He's going to have people around him that are sycophants and his bros. The Supreme Court is in his pocket. I know from our last conversation. I know you said you don't like to make predictions, but what are your predictions for what? I mean, what do the sense coming in with this new administration? What do you feel, and what do you from the media that you're absorbing?
Well, I think the first thing that you're going to see, and the thing that is most striking to me and says a lot about our politics, is that on the dais, on the stage for the inauguration, you will see some of the richest men in the world,
Hmm.
Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, the CEOs of Apple, Google, TikTok are all reported to be on the stage. And that is truly remarkable because the tech
Mm,
industry has generally been seen as a democratically aligned industry in
yeah.
terms of donations, campaign donations, and other things. And something happened over the 4 years of the Biden term that pushed tech into Donald Trump's arms. And it wasn't just Elon Musk, it was people like Tim Cook who from what I know about Tim Cook, he does not seem to be a natural Trump supporter. But
Mm,
but you see, there was a hostility to the tech industry during the Biden administration that caused an awful lot of people trouble. I mean, remember, Elon Musk voted for Democrats
yeah.
before he came out and campaigned for Trump, and it was a major snub of Elon Musk when Joe Biden held an event at the White House for electric vehicles and didn't invite the man who was CEO of the company that had 70% of market share of electric vehicles sold in the United States. And from that point on, you hear about other negative things. You hear about things the Biden administration did to somehow prevent SpaceX from launching rockets. And so it
Mm,
becomes no wonder that Elon Musk, forget about morality and in other issues and other
yeah.
viewpoints that Elon Musk may have. if he is the fiduciary of these tech companies, he could say, the Biden administration was hostile to him, and you could see
Yeah.
why he was looking for alternatives. His first alternative was Ron DeSantis in the primary. That didn't work out so well. But then he went all in on Donald Trump. And what I think we saw Joe Biden give his farewell address and issue a warning about an emerging oligarchy in the United States.
Mm.
And, I think what happened was that Elon Musk realized for something less than $300 million, he could essentially buy a seat
Mm.
at the table. Not only buy a seat at the table, he has been there throughout the transition at Mar-a-Lago, just a few
Yep.
hundred feet away from the main dining area where Donald Trump typically takes his meals. He has been around Donald Trump almost continuously since the election.
Mm.
The richest man in the world has a seat at the table, and it didn't cost him hardly anything of his
Yeah.
fortune to get that. So you can see why someone like Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos has suddenly changed their tune on
Mm.
how they're going to approach Donald Trump. They want seats at the table too. And the CEOs of Apple and Google and TikTok, which, as this is being recorded, still exists as an app. And there's some speculation about whether it will exist by the
Yeah.
time this podcast drops. But the fact that the CEO of TikTok is going to be at the Trump inauguration is an indication um, that he feels that Trump is a friend in the White
Yeah.
House. And so you can see what the value of that would be when we talk about communications technology having changed.
Mm.
TikTok is a huge outlet, and Donald Trump has been told that he's viewed quite favorably on TikTok.
Yeah.
And so it's not a mistake that he has a seat at the table. It's also an indicative, the other thing that this shows, in my view, is that Donald Trump is extremely effective at wielding power.
Mm.
And this is something that I think that so many Democrats write off Donald Trump as a moron, as just a charlatan, as a con man. He may be all of those things, but he's also extremely good at wielding power. And
Yeah.
I would expect, let's just say, I would not be surprised that some of these CEOs who are reportedly sitting on the stage with Donald Trump at his inauguration, I wouldn't be surprised if some of those CEOs learned about that from the news media,
Mm.
and that they were told that they were going to be there, and by Donald Trump allowing reports that they're going to be sitting on the stage, he's effectively daring them to not show up because it's really part of this image that he wants, which is the richest men in the world, literally the one, two, and three richest men in the world,
Mm.
are going to be sitting there with him and are going to be seen by most Americans as allies of his. And that's
Yeah.
a remarkable change.
I mean, and you can't escape it. I mean, like, a lot of, as a consumer, you think, okay, I want to invest my money in company. If companies are going to be political, then I'll invest my money in companies that I believe have my values. So at this point, Elon Musk and my values are different. So I'm not going to, if I'm going to choose, when I choose my next space rocket, I'm not going to choose one from him. But there's not a lot of choice there. I mean, more likely I'd probably be buying an electric car before a space rocket, but you never know. But I can't, Facebook, I have to use for some of my work stuff and to stay with family. And Zuckerberg's gone off into the bro sphere with Joe Rogan. I love my iPhone so much. Like I
Of
just
course.
and now you've got Apple gone. I mean, where do we go if this is this, yeah, this team of all of the products that we use, you know, where do you go if they're all in on this agenda?
Well, that shows how large the tech industry is and how influential
Yeah.
the tech industry is. It shows why Joe Biden's warning about oligarchs is
Hmm.
prescient. It's a real thing that we have to grapple with, and Donald Trump is really the first president who is embracing this idea of
Hmm.
oligarchy.
Yeah.
And it's not just the tech CEOs, although those are the most prominent in our society, probably because we all use their product. We drive a Tesla, we use an iPhone, we use Facebook, we use Instagram. I mean,
Mm.
TikTok. I mean, it's really amazing. These are things that impact every American.
Yeah.
Um, so, like I said, Donald Trump is very effective at wielding power. He's very effective at communicating with the public. People can talk about, well, he's cognitively impaired, or he doesn't make any sense when he talks. There's a simple reality is that going back through Trump's career, he spent 20 plus years um, nurturing this ability to communicate with
Mm.
people on the media, and typically
Yeah.
in alternative channels. He went on the Howard Stern show regularly.
Hmm.
He went on the Don Imus radio show regularly. He went on Fox and Friends before it was a thing. He was a
Yeah.
regular guest on all of these shows. So the fact that during his last campaign he was on Joe Rogan,
Hmm.
who his interview was seen by somewhere around 50 or 60 million people, where when he decided he wasn't going to be on 60 Minutes, which is seen as the traditional gold
Yeah.
standard for presidential candidates, he saw something there that unfortunately for Democrats, Kamala Harris did not see. Kamala Harris went on the 60 Minutes special on the candidates,
Hmm.
and it wasn't shown in the typical Sunday time slot. It was shown, I believe it was on Monday or Tuesday. She got about 4 million people who viewed that. I thought she did a fairly good job, but she also faced a somewhat antagonistic interviewer
Yeah.
on that in that interview. She faced a real journalist who was actually trying to ask her probing questions and trying
Yep.
to get to the bottom of this. Donald Trump instead went on the Joe Rogan show for 3 hours and just shot the shit with him.
Yep.
And it became such a friendly interview that even Joe Rogan, who endorsed and voted for Bernie Sanders 4 years earlier, ended up endorsing Donald Trump this time around. He promised to lower prices, not to lower the rate of inflation, but to lower
Hmm.
prices. That's next to impossible. He's already trying to walk that back.
Yep.
He promised that even as president-elect, he would end the Ukraine war. Well,
Yep.
now his advisors are suggesting that's going to take many, many more months than it's not going to be done on day one, as he suggested. He promised that he would begin a mass deportation. He would deport millions and millions of immigrants from this country. And his immigration czar, Tom Homan, is already trying to walk back those promises on the timeline. You have the realities of what he's promised legislatively. Republicans have the ability to pass legislation only if they're almost completely unified. Well,
Yeah.
we've seen the Republican Party over the last 10 years, they're not very unified. There's an awful
No.
lot of them that don't agree. There's not an ideological consistency to the Republican Party that there once was. You've got these various factions that have come together and are supportive of Trump, but who can't get over some of their issues with certain policies. The debt
Mm.
limit being one. We saw that, impact us, late last year. Um, but those are going to be constant tensions that Trump is going to have as he tries to make good on some of these promises. And is he going to be a more effective president this time? One would think he would be because he's got the experience at least. He's got
Yeah.
people around him who are more loyal. Um, but at the same time, some of the promises that he made are just going to hit reality very hard. And so once Americans begin to see that he's not fulfilling some of the most basic promises that he made, maybe they'll think less highly of Trump. I mean,
Yeah.
we like I said earlier, we have been in this change election environment now for a decade and a half.
Mm.
Every 2 years, there's a change election. I would expect, with a huge caveat here, but and I'll tell you about the caveat later. I would expect that's going to happen in the midterm elections in 2026,
Yeah.
because that's typically what happened. I would expect there to be a lot of disaffection about the party in power, and that Democrats could do quite well, particularly due to the fact that the House of Representatives is the Republicans hold only a very narrow majority. One would think Democrats could do better. But let me get
Mm,
to the caveat. And this is
mm,
where I think, once again, Biden's warning of oligarchs is definitely something to pay attention to. Elon Musk essentially bought a seat at the table, or some said bought the presidency for less than $300 million.
mm,
The oligarchs, a lot of these tech billionaires, they have billions and billions of dollars that they can spend. They
mm,
can spend that reinforcing Trump's agenda and penalizing those who oppose him. So they can
mm.
spend that. If there are lawmakers who cross Trump, they can fund primary challenges to those lawmakers.
Yeah.
So Donald Trump has an enforcement mechanism for his power. Even though he's a lame duck president, he has an enforcement mechanism that no other
Mm,
president has had to this same ability, to this same size. And so while I tend to believe historic trends are going to continue and that it's going to be a
mm.
tough year for Republicans in the midterms, that's a wild card to watch over the next 2 years.
Yeah, that is a scary thought. I mean, the other side of it, though, which will be interesting on how they govern overall beyond Trump, because I mean, the other thing that Biden did have was a lot of stability within his cabinet. I don't know if is it the almost the entire cabinet lasted 4 years. A lot of them did, didn't they? There aren't many, whereas Trump had
Oh
had a lot
yeah.
of turnover in his first cabinet. Um, and there were questions, and some of them had bad days and all that kind of stuff. The Secretary of Defense, who disappeared for a day and because he was sick and didn't tell anyone, those kind of things. But he stayed. Um, with this cabinet that's coming together, which has got to be well, they're all half of them are Fox News TV pundits with no experience in government, no experience at the levels of power that they're going to be suddenly handed. You have to think that there's going to be scandal there and controversy, no matter how much they've got the media in their pocket.
I think that's right. I mean, so on the one hand, when you see a guy like Pete Hegseth,
Yeah.
the defense secretary nominee, who forget about all of the allegations of personal behavior that he faced, drinking, sexual assault, if you forget all of that and pretend
Mm.
that doesn't exist, he's still woefully unqualified to be defense secretary
Yeah.
by any measure of defense secretary. But he has a certain skill, which is the fact that he was a Fox News host.
Yeah.
And that skill is that he's very good in front of the cameras. And so during his confirmation hearing, which should have been just a shellacking for
Mm.
anybody with all of the things against him, he successfully navigated that confirmation hearing so that most people believe, at least now, the vote hasn't happened yet, that he's not only going to sail through committee, he's going to get to the Senate floor. His nomination will get to the Senate floor, and he will be confirmed as defense secretary. That's amazing. And he's got that skill because
Mm.
the skills necessary to be in those roles, at least one of them, is to be very good in front of the TV cameras. Now,
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. When he gets into the job and things don't go the way, because he's somebody who's never managed more than a few dozen people before,
Yeah.
and he now has a department with several million people, that could be a total disaster. It could be scandal. It could be dangerous for the country.
Mm.
So we'll see how that plays out. But Trump has clearly changed which skills he values at this point more. His first
Yeah.
administration was hardly scandal free. There was almost a scandal a week, it seemed. And
Mm.
I think that he would have been better served in that first administration of having more people who are good in front of television cameras. Maybe that's what he's prioritized. Maybe he realizes scandal is inevitable for his second term, and that's what he's prioritizing.
Well, because he governs by perception, and
Yep.
that's what matters more than the reality of what's happening. When his people believe he built the wall, he never built the wall. They believe the insurrection didn't happen when there was an insurrection that happened. So I guess if he's got effective communicators that can just make people believe that the sky is not falling, then that's what will work. I don't know
Yeah.
how that, which goes against the idea of good governance for the largest, most powerful country in the world. I want to finish. I always appreciate your time. I want to finish on what your specialty is, of course, which is absorbing media and analyzing media and presenting media as you do so wonderfully.
Thank
I
you.
still don't know if there's any website that, as I said before, gets refreshed more than yours does on my browsers, and is still, relevant and giving the information, especially for somebody who I'm one of those people that I canceled my Washington Post subscription in protest, which I normally don't do that kind of thing, but I was pretty annoyed. But then I don't know where else, I'm going to run out of places to get news from if I start canceling, if they're all on there on that fucking dais with him. Um, are you worried about the media? Because you're seeing it from all these different sources. Where are you still feeling? Do you feel like there's going to be a lack of trust? Do you feel like because like ABC News settled with Trump when they definitely, I don't think should have? I don't know how you feel about that. Do you think they're going to be afraid to go up and hold him to power, to hold him to account?
Yes, no, I absolutely think that. And also just, I mean, this is something we've seen over the last several decades, but there is no common source of news on which voters can make opinions and judgments of their public officials.
Yeah.
Everything has been broken apart. So on the one hand, I find that very troubling.
Mm,
On the other hand, I think it makes sites like Political Wire more important. If you trust my view of the world, what I will try to do every single day, and I do it from very early in the morning to very late at night, is I try to show you what I think are the most important things in politics today.
mm,
And sometimes I get it wrong, but hopefully most times my judgment is right. And I'm trying to share with you those things that are important, that are interesting, that are relevant, that are true as well. And, so maybe Political Wire becomes a much more important vehicle for people
mm,
informing themselves. Maybe they're not going to trust the Washington Post and people are going to cancel their subscriptions. Well, I'm still going to read the Washington Post, but I'm going to try to filter what I think in the Washington Post today you should read, what in the New York Times you should read, the Wall Street Journal, all of the above. But, the other thing that's happening in the media is that there's plenty of podcasts like this one.
yeah.
There's plenty of newsletters, on Substack and on other platforms that former journalists are
Yeah.
deciding, you want to know something? I'm not going to work for the Washington Post anymore. So if you're Jennifer Rubin and you were a columnist for the Washington Post for years, she quit because she
Yeah.
thinks that Jeff Bezos is no longer worth working for, and she's starting her own newsletter essentially.
Mm,
And that's interesting and that's exciting. And many people have done that over the years. And I think that's useful. Paul Krugman, who was the, long time, 20 plus year
yeah.
um, columnist at the New York Times, he started a newsletter. And I have to say, when he was with the New York Times, he wrote, I think, twice a week. Now that he has his own newsletter, I swear he writes every single day. And every single morning in my inbox is Paul Krugman's latest. And I devour it every single morning because I find
Mm,
his viewpoints fascinating. And so, yeah, we're having an upheaval of our media environment and our resulting media diets. But
mm,
um, but there's good stuff out there. We just have to find it. And so hopefully Political Wire will be part of the new ecosystem that helps people find these articles. It's not so the
yeah.
Political Wire is not so new. It's been around 25 years, but
Yeah.
that's that's been the driving force behind what I do.
Yeah. And I mean, what's I guess what's the next thing though is then because you're a great source, for people who especially want to be consuming that political news. But then the question for the broader public, and I don't know if this is something that you wonder is how does the not normal, the typical person who's not as plugged in, because that was a big factor in this election, is that the people who were reading the news and paid attention voted for Kamala Harris by wide margins. The people who thought, ugh, I don't really know who she is, and Biden's old, and seemed to forget about COVID, what Trump did in COVID, went for Trump. So, I mean, do you see, is there a way to break through to those people in this
I
environment?
mean, that's an interesting question. So, I mean, we talk about podcasts, and you have a very good podcast here. podcasts like Joe Rogan's, or
Yeah.
when I heard some of the podcasts that Donald Trump was appearing on, I'll admit to you, I hadn't heard of most of them. I'd
Yeah.
never heard of them. And it shows you how segmented things are.
Mm,
Um, but at the same time, my own guilty thought was, my goodness, I probably should know about some of these podcasts. They have
yeah.
millions of listeners, and I should probably pay a little bit more attention to
Mm,
those. And particularly as you see politicians appearing on these podcasts, because they know the audience they're seeking is listening. And
yeah.
so they're not all political podcasts. You know, it's kind of like on TV, we have shows, you know, on ABC like The View, which
Mm,
is a popular place on mainstream media for politicians to occasionally drop by and chat
yeah.
with the ladies of The View. But podcasts are really the same thing. It's just that, you know, unknown to many mainstream media people, some of them are quite large. And,
Yeah.
you know, Joe Rogan's podcast is probably as influential as any media outlet, you know, in the country.
Yeah. I mean, well, although I did just get to explain to my wife, was it yesterday or today, who Joe Rogan was. She's in a different media sphere than I am, at least. Um, well, Tegan, it was. I really appreciate you coming on, and again, I love The Wire and consume it as much as I can, and really appreciate your work. And it's great to catch up and talk to you and get your insight. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks for having me, Eric.
So that's it. There we go. Thank you to Tegan for coming on the podcast again. Really great to catch up and get his insight, very balanced view about what's happening, and I think especially what's going to be interesting to see is all these media players like the, Zuckerberg, Bezos, Tim Cook from Apple, all of them coming together around the Trump presidency. And I think that is going to be a big thrust of what is yet to come for the next few years. And the fact that we've seen this alignment of people say, well, Trump is president this time. We're going to embrace it and see if we can get something out of it, just like everybody else who's ever been around Donald Trump. Seeing these people use him, whether he realizes it or not, I think is going to be something that we have to watch very, very closely. And of course, the place to watch that, other than this podcast, is on the Political Wire, which is Tegan's fantastic website. So thank you to him for coming back on the pod. Thank you to Mark, the producer, as always, for putting everything together. We will see you next time. Thank you for listening, watching, and doing all those things. Give us a review, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, tell me how I'm awful. I love those comments. I really appreciate them, and they're deeply moving to me. So thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Cheers.